morning, everybody. I am not Lofty. I am Greg Ehrenberg. I'm filling in for Lofty, who had a doctor's appointment this morning. Apologies for starting a couple minutes late. Jordan Klein was having some technical issues, as has been the case on a lot of these strategy shows as of late. I think this is 2 in a row, Adam, that you and I have done together. 2 shows in a row that we've done that we've had to start late because of Jordan.
Yeah, I mean, it's really frustrating when you wake up early. You specifically set an alarm clock. You wake up, you make sure you're ready to go, and then Jordan is having issues.
Yeah, exactly. I was ready to go hours ago. I certainly knew I was filling in for Lofty ahead of time. You were well rested and slept, an ample amount of hours, but you were certainly up early this morning yourself. But Jordan has told me the one way that he guarantees every show will start on time, you have to follow him on Twitter at Jordan D. Klein. He thinks that I cannot get him more Twitter followers. Go ahead and follow at Jordan D. Klein on Twitter. Let's get him some followers. And then his ex-girlfriend will feel scorned that she has left somebody who's so famous. So guys, follow at Jordan D. Klein on Twitter. Today's show is sponsored by No House Advantage. If you guys have not checked out No House Advantage yet, sign up using the promo code Awesemo. All new users that use our promo code get a $25 bonus on their first deposit. Really different way to play DFS. These are prop-based DFS contests. Adam, just kind of overall thoughts, just in general on this slate. 3 games. We've got Brooklyn, Boston. We've got Philly, Toronto, Chicago, Milwaukee. Do you have kind of just any sort of big picture thoughts about today's games?
I'm excited to watch the Brooklyn and Boston game. But I think from more of an overarching view, it's different than yesterday in that you have Embiid, Giannis, to a lesser extent, Durant, Harden, Kyrie, but we know that it's difficult to find good, cheap value in the postseason. And on a slate like yesterday, it's not as important. Like, you could forego the PJ Tuckers of the world because the most expensive guy on the slate was $9,800, and you didn't even have to go up to Morant. Today, it's a little bit more important to find some risky value guys because Giannis and Embiid, they're so good. Granted, they are both sub 11K on DraftKings for some reason. DraftKings, I think, deciding to make it easy to make lineups today, but they're still a little bit more expensive than we had yesterday.
Yeah, and we do have the Toronto situation once again, where we got Gary Trent is questionable, Scotty Barnes is out, so not traditional value in terms of really cheap guys to play, but like Fred VanVleet looks really mispriced. But that aside, let's start talking about today's game, starting with that Brooklyn-Boston game. And I didn't know what to think of this in the first game of the series, but I did think that there was some relevance to the narrative of that. It's Ramadan. Kyrie was playing an afternoon game. He wasn't allowed to eat all day. He wasn't allowed to drink. He was going to play an entire NBA playoff game where he's not allowed to consume any kind of water or anything. I thought that could be an issue down the stretch. Couldn't have been further from the case, because on a day where Kevin Durant struggled, Kyrie Irving went completely nuts in Boston against fans who were very warmly welcoming him into the arena, back for the first time in quite a while. But what do you make of Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving as pay-up options for Game 2?
I had no idea Kyrie was Muslim until right now. But I mean, they're going to need to play a lot of minutes. You got 42 minutes from Kyrie last game. You got 41 from Durant. I expect very similar. Boston's defense is really good, and especially if they're able to get away with what they were doing in Game 1. I mean, they were extremely physical with Kevin Durant. It'll be interesting to see if they're able to do that all series long, or if you start getting some calls going Durant's way, which would really open things up for him. But both of these guys, I think, are good pay-up options. They're not on the same level as Giannis and Embiid, just because they have to play with each other. So, whereas Giannis is, obviously he's playing with Middleton and Drew, but Giannis is going to get his. Embiid, you have seen, kind of take a step back in the postseason. Harden's doing more. Kind of a similar thing with Kyrie and Durant. You got the great game from Kyrie last time out. He shot really well. He really dominated that game. You could conceivably see that be Kevin Durant today, and Kyrie's not as good. But in tournaments, I think either of those guys are good. And then Bruce Brown at 6K. He's kind of the one other guy in this Brooklyn rotation that you can feel pretty confident in his minutes. He played almost 37 minutes last game. Everybody else, you're kind of at Steve Nash's whim, but Bruce Brown, one or the other, is going to get a lot of minutes.
Yeah, and then as for the Durant versus Irving thing, and let me check to see what our most recent ownership is, because I'm curious to see what the split is after Kyrie was so much better last game. Because going into that game, Durant was the more popular of the two plays, and for today, it would help if I could spell Kyrie correctly while I was doing this. Sorry. So Kyrie's only projected for 5% ownership right now. And we have Durant at 13% ownership over on DraftKings. FanDuel, Durant is also only projected for 12% ownership. Kyrie at 8. Those seem like really low numbers on both sites. And I know that we have guys to pay up for on this slate, but certainly much more than we had yesterday, where there's Durant, there's Irving. We've got the Sixers guys. We've got Giannis. Those seem like low numbers to me, though, when you can get Kyrie at 5% and Durant at 14%. The matchup against Boston obviously isn't ideal, but this game does have the highest total on the slate. And it stands to reason that in a 1-0 hold, these guys are both going to play north of 40 minutes. Do you think those ownerships are a little bit too light?
Yeah, like I think it's a situation where I understand why the ownership is so low, because I think that Durant and Kyrie are a little bit too close to Giannis and Embiid in terms of salary. But at the same time, I mean, it's a 3-game slate. Like you kind of just have to take a step back. It's a 3-game slate where Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving are going to play 40 minutes apiece, and you can get them at 13 and 4% owned. You don't have to really go into detail there. Anybody who's familiar with NBA basketball is aware that Kevin Durant or Kyrie Irving in a 1-game sample can easily, go for 60, 70 DraftKings points.
And then just one other question, because we do have just a lot of guys to pay up for on this slate, and we have seen a negative correlation between Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving, because both of them are not entirely scoring dependent, but for the upper bound limits of their ceiling, they are dependent on scoring. Does that make it so you wouldn't want Kyrie Irving and Kevin Durant in the same lineup?
Yeah, like I'm not going to set a rule for it, but I don't think it's going to happen that often anyway, since neither of them project as great options. Them getting into lineups, even one of them, is going to be kind of tricky. But yeah, like ideally, you're not going to have them together. If I'm playing one lineup, I'd pay attention to it. If I'm playing 150, I'm not going to pay attention to it. But I don't think it'll really happen anyway.
And then one other thing I think we should talk about when it comes to the Nets is, what do you make of the center rotation? Because Andre Drummond, who down the stretch of the year started to play increased minutes, he saw his playing time fall off in a big way to open up the postseason. So going up against Boston in that game, we did see Nick Claxton end up getting a little bit more run than I would have expected, and Drummond left. So only 17 minutes for Drummond. That was the least he had played since March 6th. And by the way, that game March 6th, also against Boston. Is this just something that we should read into and think that, like, hey, he played limited minutes, it was the least he played since the last time he played against Boston, that maybe Steve Nash just views this as not a great matchup to get Drummond extended minutes?
Yeah, I buy into the Claxton minutes. So I buy into the Claxton minutes in the sense of, I do think he is better here than Andre Drummond is. I think he continues to get run over Drummond. I wouldn't be shocked if you start seeing neither center close. Maybe you get Patty Mills instead of Claxton, or you get, Curry was already in there. So maybe you get Dragic instead of Claxton, you get Mills instead of Claxton down the stretch. I think that's possible. But I do think Claxton plays more minutes than Drummond.
Shout out to Ashish, just left us a super chat. Took down 62K on FanDuel last night. Appreciate you guys. Keep up the solid work. Let's go Nets. I agree with everything you said there. I appreciate. Thank you for appreciating us. Thank you for telling us to keep up the solid work. Congratulations to you. But let's go Celtics from my standpoint. That's where my rooting interests are. But we certainly do appreciate the super chat.
That's an awesome win. Congrats.
Yeah, very, very cool. Always like when people come on and tell us they had good hits. Certainly, I didn't last night, so it's good to see that you did, because my slate sucked for me yesterday.
I stopped watching it after I stopped even paying attention after like 30 minutes. I ended up making like 13K or something on NBA.
Nice.
I gave up like as soon as Bogdanovich had 3 fouls, and then Bam got 4. I just didn't even look anymore. And then at the end of the night, I looked. I was like, oh, cool, that worked out.
Brandon Clark was so popular that I thought that Steven Adams was a good pivot play. Turns out Steven Adams was not a good pivot play.
Oh, they were talking about you. Okay. I saw people being like, imagine doing a show 12 hours after touting Steven Adams. And I was like, all I said was that, like, I wasn't confident that in what Steven Adams' minutes were going to be. Like, maybe he plays more. I'm glad to know they were mocking you and not me.
Oh, yeah. No, that's all on me. That was my entire Twitter feed last night, was people celebrating playing a 50% owned Brandon Clark instead of Steven Adams. I was certainly on the wrong side of that. But I guess in hindsight, maybe I would have pivoted with like Xavier Tillman. I don't know. It was never going to be a spot where I was going to do well on that slate, because I did not like the Brandon Clark chalk. That aside, talking about this slate, We've talked about the big men, Nick Claxton and Andre Drummond. One other Nets player I want to ask you about is Seth Curry, because he was a really good fantasy producer for the Nets for a brief period of time. Some of that was due to Kyrie Irving being out, but he's also been dealing with an ankle injury that's really hampered him as of late. The minutes are still kind of there. The last handful of games, 30 minutes, 29, 34, 30, but we haven't seen quite the same efficiency or usage for Seth Curry. Do you view him as somebody who could potentially be an upside play for cheap that's kind of being slept on just because we're hurting for value on this slate?
Yeah, I mean, at 4,500, yeah, he's dealing with an injury and all of that, but in 150 lineups at least, I'm certainly going to take some shots at Seth Curry. I'm not going to be very confident in it, but same goes for Goran Dragic. At 4K, he played 27 minutes last game. Like I said a minute ago, I wouldn't be shocked if maybe you start seeing the smaller closing lineups for the Nets and Dragic picks up a few more minutes. So either of Dragic or Curry, I think you can take some shots at. Also, I wish I was as high as the guy who is in chat asking Josh questions like he's here.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that people should come into chat and troll Josh regardless of when he's on shows or not.
Yeah,
so yeah. I'm all for it. But as Aaron Campbell wants to know, does Josh think, and I don't know, does he think me or you or Josh?
I don't know.
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, one of us he thinks
probably
is Josh.
You, because like I'm on this show every single day and you're not. So he probably just doesn't know who you are.
Which also, I think Jordan, I think Jordan had no clue we've ever done a show with each other before or something. Because before, when Jordan's telling me, hey, just so you know, sometimes Adam doesn't come in 15 minutes early for shows. Like, yeah, I know, I've done a show with Adam before. Like, we've probably done like 100 something shows together. I'm aware, Jordan. I know how it works. Just because you have to start the show late doesn't mean you have to pass on blame to other people as well.
Yeah. I love how he's like preemptively blaming me when he's the one screwing everything up.
Always. Jordan, he's got to get his coffee ready. He's got to go to the bathroom. He oversleeps. He's got a lot going on. Anything else from the Nets here that stand out to you?
Aaron Campbell clarified he meant me. No, I actually, I admitted that I was wrong on Twitter a while ago. CJ McCollum has a lot more left in the tank than I thought he did.
Yeah, and I think also it was a lot of advanced metrics didn't really value CJ McCollum very highly during the time he was in Portland. And a lot of like those kind of like whatever you want to call them, the catch-all value metrics. I think the fit next to Damian Lillard is not ideal for him. There was too much skill overlap. And now that he's in Portland, now that he's out of Portland and in New Orleans, not playing with Damian Lillard, I just think it's a better situation for him personally. And I think that team's going to be awesome next year when they assuming they get Zion back.
Yeah, I agree with that. But like even when Lillard was out, McCollum just kind of like it seemed like he had lost a step in Portland. And so like when that trade happened, I kind of thought Larry Nance was like the most appealing piece for the Pels. I thought McCollum was kind of just a guy that was like interchangeable with Norman Powell. CJ McCollum is a hell of a lot better still than I was giving him credit for.
Yeah, and by the way, somebody asked me, do I think Jimmy Butler is trash? I like Jimmy Butler as a player. I just think he gets injured a lot and he's fun to make fun of. But in terms of Jimmy Butler as a player, I think he's a very good basketball player. Moving on to the Celtics side of the game, and I think there are some guys here that kind of have depressed price points. Jason Tatum, 9,500 on DK. We've got Al Horford, 6,400. Derek White off the bench at 51. I kind of think that he's in play because we did see a little bit more of a condensed Celtics rotation last game than what we saw at times down the stretch of the season, particularly when we got 45 minutes out of Jason Tatum, 41 and a half minutes from Al Horford, 40 minutes from Jaylen Brown, 36 from Smart, 28 from Derek White off the bench. Do you think we could just expect this is the playoff rotation now?
Yeah, and I think this series is really interesting as far as the playing time goes because obviously you project more minutes for main pieces of all of these teams because it's the postseason, but you have to keep in mind too, it's round one. So a lot of these games don't really come down to the wire because a lot of times, it's the 8 versus the 1 or, 7 versus 2. But here, when you talk about a team like Brooklyn, I mean, the 7 seed isn't supposed to have Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving. So this is like a real playoff series that, you would get second or third round typically. So I think you do just need more minutes. Like you can count on more minutes from guys on both sides. And then that goes to Tatum and Brown and Horford and Smart. So it makes it a really appealing game. Brooklyn obviously not very good defensively either. So that works in Boston's favor, but also just being able to rely on the minutes for those guys. Derek White at 5,100, I think is still pretty risky because he's out there more for defensive reasons and, not doing a whole lot offensively, but still likely to play enough minutes to at times pay off 5,100. But the other four, Tatum, Brown, Horford, Smart, I think all look fantastic.
Yeah, I mean, it's guys who are just kind of priced the same as they were in the regular season. Al Horford's slightly more expensive, but also keep in mind Robert Williams is out. And then also, I mean, if we're going to get 40 plus minutes out of all four of these guys, which seems within the realm of outcomes, I mean, they're just all a little bit underpriced and some of my favorite targets on the entire slate. Do you think that you're going to have any kind of try to limit the amount of Celtics you can get in any individual lineup? Because I think if I just ran my projections as is, I haven't built any lineups yet, I would end up with a ton of exposure to Boston.
Yeah, I mean, so somebody asked me on Twitter yesterday too. On 3 game slates, my general rule is just to cap teams at 3. I obviously change that, depending on the slate. Like if one team has 6 good plays and no other team has more than 1, maybe I'll go 4. But here, I think I'm probably capping it at 3. Even though Boston has 4 guys that look very good, and then another guy in white that looks fine. It's still when Tatum's the way I think about it. Let's say you have Tatum at 9,500, you have Smart at 5,800. You have Horford at 6,400. Do you really want Jaylen Brown at 8,600? Or in that one particular lineup, would you rather go to one of the guys from Chicago or Milwaukee or, Toronto? And that's kind of how I think about it, is like, it's really difficult for all 4 of those guys to get there at the same time, even though from a median standpoint, all 4 of them look good.
Yeah, that's I'm curious if I just uploaded my projection and ran a crunch now, just totally unencumbered. I'm sure I would end up getting to some lineups with all 4 of them, maybe even with Derek White also, if I set no kind of restrictions, just because the minutes are going to be projected so high that it's going to make them look good on a points per dollar outcome. We have a super chat here from Jay Miz. He wants us to know, are we calling for a KD or a Kyrie game tonight? First of all, I wish I knew for sure, but if I had to guess which one is more likely, I'd say KD, just because I think he's better than Kyrie. And I think that also the ownership projections we have right now might be a little bit too low on Kyrie, just because he had such a big game last time. And I think that probably will influence more of the public when we just saw the same exact matchup. But if I had to guess one, I would guess KD. Do you have a lean either way?
Yeah, I mean, my guess is KD for the reasons you said. He's better. Not a knock on Kyrie at all, but KD's better than Kyrie. And then also, just you kind of typically see like, one guy does it game 1, the next guy does it game 2. The one concern is like if they continue to officiate the series the way they officiated game 1, KD's gonna have a very difficult time.
And then is there anything else from Boston here that's worth getting to? Because like we were talking about, the rotation is so condensed. It's hard to imagine any of these bench guys have that much upside. Tice did start last game. He did get into some foul trouble, which limited his playing time a little bit. But is there anybody else outside of the more important Boston pieces that you think is worthwhile?
I mean, if you want to take some shots at Tice just because he's cheap and you're trying to get some stars in your lineup, that's fine. I don't expect him to play a ton of minutes here. I expect low 20s again. Kind of the same thing for Grant Williams. Like he's 3,600. He's not a great point per minute guy. He didn't play a ton of minutes last game, but he is like a good, useful piece in Boston's rotation. If, for example, Al Horford were to get in foul trouble, or they just decide they don't want to play Al Horford 42 minutes, like Williams is kind of like the next guy up if something happens to anybody ahead of him. So at 3,600, like there's at least a path, but certainly not talking about guys that I'm prioritizing in terms of Tyson Williams.
All right, let's move on to the next game. But first, guys, do us a favor, like the video and subscribe to the YouTube channel. It does us a whole lot of good. And don't forget to follow Jordan on Twitter at Jordan D. Klein. Big initiative by me is to get Jordan more followers, because he thinks that nobody will want to follow him. Prove him wrong and follow him over on Twitter. Next game here, we have the Philadelphia 76ers at the Toronto Raptors. And I thought this was a spot where Philly could struggle in games in Toronto because they're missing Matisse Thybulle, but it's ultimately not going to matter too much now because Toronto is dealing with all these injuries of their own, where Scotty Barnes is likely out for the series. We've got Gary Trent Jr. dealing with an illness that has him questionable. But let's start with the Philly side, because there's a couple of good payoff options here in Joel Embiid and James Harden. Of the two, which are you getting to more for this slate?
$8,900 Harden, I think. So, yeah. I mean, I haven't built lineups yet, so maybe I'm wrong. But just looking at the pricing and thinking about this slate, you have Giannis that you really want to get to. Embiid is certainly a great option at 10.6, but Harden at 8,900 is really cheap. It was nice to see Embiid's usage rate get back to 34.5% last game. Things kind of, normalized. In that first game, you had like Tyrese Maxey leading the way. You had Harden's usage rate up there. Tobias Harris's usage rate was up. Last game, you got 34.5% for Embiid, 17 for Maxey, 19.9 for Harden, 19.2 for Harris. Things, kind of normalized. Embiid still didn't have a monster game, but certainly is capable of it. But 8,900 for somebody like Harden, when you expect him to play 40 plus minutes, and even if he's not getting a ton of usage, going to get a lot of assist opportunities, I would rather go to the cheaper guy.
Yeah, and then here's something I'm on the same page as you. I just think on a points per dollar basis, Harden rates out a little bit better, and he's also just cheaper than the other stars on the slate with comparable upside. Here's something I've kind of missed out on in the series. I have not been really high on Tobias Harris or Tyrese Maxey. I've gravitated more towards Embiid and Harden, and we've seen the Raptors kind of make more of a concerted effort to make other guys outside of Embiid beat them. And as a result, we've seen more usage go to Harris and Maxey. Maxey in particular has played extremely well. But now both of them are a little bit more priced up after back-to-back big games, particularly from Tyrese Maxey. How do you view them at their current salaries now?
Yeah, I mean, they're both secondary options to me still. I think that they're pretty much correctly priced. You can expect a lot of playing time from them. And the other thing to keep in mind is, like, while Maxey's usage rate came down last game to 17%, it's like 17% isn't bad if every shot you take is a wide open 3-pointer. So there's still upside there. And then obviously, you could just get a game like game one where he gets more shots up. Toronto really works hard to get the ball out of Embiid's hands and forces Maxey to beat them. So I do think that the way Toronto wants to play this defensively is good for Tyrese Maxey. It's good for Tobias Harris. So I do like those guys in tournaments, especially at low ownership. But at the same time, the issue is that you're just going to have a lot of, when you look at other teams, you're going to have a lot of guys that are just like either not that much more expensive or even a little bit cheaper that we know are main parts of their team intentionally, as opposed to somebody like Maxey or Harris, where if Philly had their way, it's just Embiid and Harden taking every shot. So that's the concern. But at low ownership, I do still like these guys.
Yeah, and by the way, as for the current projected ownership, we have starting with on FanDuel, Tyrese Maxey is currently projected for 8% ownership. Tobias Harris projected for 15%. Over on DK, we have Harris projected for 10% ownership, and Maxey is projected for 8% right now. So pretty modest ownership on both of them on both sites. Not the salaries have started to come up a little bit. But now we don't have any Matisse Thybulle for this game. The game is in Toronto. So because of the Canada vax laws and just travel restrictions, he is not allowed to play across the border. Danny Green is likely going to start because he's been starting in other games. Does this make Danny Green a viable value play? Because I do think now, even though he isn't a good points per dollar producer, I expect a few extra minutes to go to him with the absence of Thybulle. Or are you also projecting for that?
Yeah, I think you get a few more minutes for Green. Thybulle only played 10 minutes last game, so that's worth noting. But and you also could get those minutes, going to Niang. You could get them going to Shake Milton. But Green played 37 minutes last game anyway. I think basically the way I'm viewing it is that it helps to solidify those minutes. I think that you see something similar to that again, as opposed to the 22 minutes that Green played in game one. At 3,600, yeah, Danny Green sucks from a fantasy standpoint, but there are guys to pay up for today, and he is only 3,600. So it's a spot where I think I probably just end up with a decent amount of Danny Green and hope for the best. He is projected for 34% ownership. So it is a situation where I don't mind in larger field tournaments just rolling the dice on anybody that isn't 34% owned and just kind of, hoping that they beat Danny Green. But from a projection standpoint, he's underpriced given the playing time he's likely to get.
Yeah. And then also, once again, there's so many stars to pay up for on this slate. Is Danny Green's not likely to go out and score 30 fantasy points, but 20 could be enough to be optimal on this slate when you just consider like James Harden, Kyrie Irving, Kevin Durant, Jason Tatum, Giannis. There's so many players to pay up for, and we need that value. Do you think it's reasonable to say like, hey, Danny Green could go out and only score 20 fantasy points on FanDuel and DK, but end up in an optimal lineup just because a couple of stars go off and there is such a hurting for value?
Yeah, that's like the big difference on tonight's slate versus last night's, I think, is like if you put Danny Green on last night's slate, obviously everything we're saying about him would be the same, where he's going to play a lot of minutes, he's cheap and all of that, but he would be like PJ Tucker, where I thought he was kind of more popular than he should be because you didn't really need to go that cheap. Tonight though, you're really getting a benefit if you go to some cheap guys, getting Giannis into your lineups. Like, last night the highest projected guys on the slate were Towns and Morant around like 50 DraftKings points. Tonight you're talking about, guys like Embiid and Giannis where they're up around 60. So you just get more of a benefit by getting them into your lineup. And as a result, you don't need 25 from Danny Green. You just need like 18 to 20, and then you need Giannis to do what Giannis does.
And then is there anybody else from the Sixers that you might want to stretch and get to in large field GPPs just because Thibault is out, whether Shake Milton or George Niang might play a couple extra minutes and that make them somebody that can end up putting up good value?
Yeah, I mean, I think both guys, like, in theory, make some sense when you're getting 34% ownership to Danny Green. And you think about, like, okay, if something goes wrong or for some reason Danny Green doesn't play 34 minutes, who's getting more? And the answer is one of Milton or Niang. I still have a difficult time really getting to them, I think, but that they would be the guys that if you are trying to play that angle where you say, like, okay, well, I want to go in the Danny Green price range, but I don't want to play Danny Green. And you're willing to just accept that, like, 9 times out of 10, both of these guys are going to be awful. Those are the guys that you would go to if you're trying to play that angle.
All right, now let's talk about the Toronto side of the game where we do have the injury situation I talked about before. We have Scotty Barnes is not expected to play, officially listed as doubtful, but all indications are this is an injury that's probably going to prevent him from playing in the rest of the series unless it gets extended really late. Then we also have Gary Trent Jr., who's listed as questionable with an illness. What do you make of Trent for today? Because number one, it's an illness, and we don't know what the information is on the illness, but I mean, he's been dealing with it for 5 days now. So you'd think there's a good chance he's feeling better. He played last game. It was only 10 minutes. So there's clearly risk here. But his price has also come down. Do you view him as somebody who's a risky but viable tournament play, just with the hopes that if he's in there, he's feeling better and is back to his normal self?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting spot, and it's a really difficult thing to project because I don't have Gary Trent's phone number. I don't know how he's feeling. So, like, the fact that it's not an injury, like you said, if even if it were an injury, like let's say it was a hamstring injury, you would kind of be talking about it the same way, where it's like, okay, let's say Gary Trent starts and we know he's dealing with this injury, in this case, an illness. There's a good chance that he just gives it his all and his all isn't good enough and he plays 10, 12, 14 minutes and you don't want him. But at 5K, if he is good to go, he goes out there today and he starts playing and he's like, oh, I feel like shit, but I can make it through. Then you want him at 5K because he's a good fantasy player and he's only 5K. I guess the thing that makes him difficult is, like, it's not like it's a binary thing where he either plays 10 minutes or he plays 38. Even if he plays 24 minutes, you probably don't want him at 5K. If he plays 25 minutes, you probably don't want him at 5K. So that's kind of the issue. And he is getting 21% ownership right now. I think that could come down. I think it's really difficult to project ownership in a situation like this. But if he's low owned, I like taking some shots on Gary Trent and just hoping that he feels fine. I think the most likely case is that he ends up not being a very good play because I doubt that he just in 2 days goes from extremely sick to, yeah, I'm good to go play 38 minutes.
So here's the other point too on Gary Trent, his ownership. And like you said, we do have him projected for a healthy amount of ownership, no pun intended with the situation, but yeah, he's around 20% on both sites. But when people are building their lineups after what happened with Gary Trent in the last 2 games, sucked in game 1, game 2, he plays under 10 minutes, leaves with an illness. That is not going to be a button people are going to click. But at the same time, based on his regular season production, just from a projection standpoint, it's impossible to not project him well at his depressed salary. When he is $5,000 over on DraftKings and then over on FanDuel, Trent is at 5,300. It's impossible to not project him well if you're giving him his regular season minutes. So because ownership projections are going to be more math-based, it's just going to come out and not include the human element of, yeah, but this guy sucked last game and only played 10 minutes. So I think that ultimately Trent's probably going to be sub 10% owned. If you were asking me over under on this projection, I'd easy under.
Yeah, I agree with that. Assuming we don't get some sort of report like Gary Trent feels fantastic.
Yeah.
Gary Trent's, outside running laps around the arena, he feels so good. Like, then the ownership's going to look more in line with what we have projected right now. But yeah, like you can only do so much. As far as I know, I don't know exactly what goes into our ownership projections. I'm pretty sure there is not a "this guy is deathly ill" button. Subtract ownership.
Yeah, it's one of those things there's just no mathematical situation for. But I think we should also discuss what happens if Gary Trent doesn't play. It was something we weren't expecting last game. We weren't expecting Thad Young, Gary Trent, or Scotty Barnes to play. Ultimately, Trent and Thad Young did get upgraded from doubtful to questionable to in shortly before the game. But if Trent does end up sitting in addition to Scotty Barnes sitting, who would benefit the most from Toronto?
So my assumption last game, both shows I did were assuming Trent wasn't going to play.
Yeah.
My assumption was that you were going to get Precious Achua and Chris Boucher in the starting lineup. That's my assumption again here. Boucher last game in the second half, Trent played the first 2 minutes and 25 seconds. He never came back. Chris Boucher never left the floor after that point. Boucher was also the first guy off the bench for Trent in the first half. So my expectation is that you would get that lineup. I know some people were saying, Armani Brooks, Malachi Flynn. Flynn did play 21 minutes off the bench, but based on the trends that we saw from Nick Nurse during the regular season, I think he's very comfortable going with a lineup that is just Fred VanVleet and a bunch of 6'7" guys across the board. I don't think he minds playing Siakam at the 3 alongside Boucher and Achua. So that would be my expectation.
I know that Flynn sucked last game, but just because he played over 20 minutes with Trent only playing 10, do you view him as somebody who could potentially be a contrarian option to get to if there's no Gary Trent? Because the minutes were there, and you'd have to figure he does more than nothing again.
I didn't hear who the question was about. I heard
Malachi Flynn. If Trent is out, would you view him as a deep GBP play just because he did get those 21 minutes last game?
Yeah, at 3,900. I think last game did show us that Flynn was ahead of Armani Brooks, clearly, because he played 21 minutes and Brooks played 0. If Trent were out, like I think you could get more minutes from Thaddeus Young here. He only played 8 minutes last game. I would expect Young to be cutting into Malachi Flynn just because, I think that Nick Nurse is pretty comfortable, running VanVleet / Siakam at point guard. Like, you don't need Malachi Flynn. And I think that Young kind of just fits what Nick Nurse likes to do a little bit more. But at 3,900, if you do happen to get 20 to 22 minutes from Flynn, he's going to beat Danny Green often enough to be worth a look in larger field tournaments as a flyer.
Yeah, and as of right now, he's going to be projected for no ownership, but that's also because we're assuming Gary Trent is in. If Gary Trent is in, then I think there's no reason to roster Malachi Flynn. On the high end of the Raptors guys, Pascal Siakam, Fred VanVleet, we know they are going to be playing massive minutes. Fred VanVleet is one of my favorite, if not my favorite play on the slate. I wouldn't be surprised at all if he ends up being my most rostered player. Are you on the same page as me when it comes to VanVleet and how are you going to handle Siakam as well?
Yeah, I really like the price tags on both guys, but particularly VanVleet. I mean, he just really stands out at 7,500 for somebody that you can expect to play 40 plus minutes. I mean, Toronto's a team where you really don't have to guess at what the playoff rotation is going to look like because Nick Nurse just plays it all season long. So you can feel pretty confident in 40 plus minutes from VanVleet. 7,500 is very inexpensive for that. And the same goes for Siakam. You can count on 40 plus. We know he's a good point per minute guy, around 1.1 fantasy points per minute. Both of those guys look really good. Anunoby at 6,400, I think, is more correctly priced. Achua at 4,600, I think more correctly priced. It's worth keeping in mind that, there can be minutes there for him. He played 29 minutes without even stepping on the floor in the fourth quarter last game, but his rates and his production does take a pretty drastic hit when he plays alongside Pascal Siakam. So you have to keep that in mind as well. So I think Achua and Anunoby and Boucher, they're all playable. They're all fine, but I think more correctly priced, whereas Siakam and VanVleet are still pretty clearly underpriced.
Yeah, and I thought Anunoby was a good play last slate, but I was not expecting the kind of ownership he had. I don't remember the exact number, but in certain tournaments on DK, we saw over 50% ownership to OG Anunoby. And once again today, he's projected to be really popular, 36% ownership on FanDuel. And then on DK, projected for 25, a little bit more modest. So like you said, I think the price tag on him is about fair. And that makes me think the ownership here is a little bit too high, particularly on FanDuel. What do you make of the ownership on Anunoby? And also considering that he did end up being just crazy, crazy popular last slate.
Yeah, I mean, I think the price tag coming up a little bit probably drives that ownership down some. And then also just the fact that I think you do get a little bit more stars and scrub builds here. like I said, I think Anunoby's a good play. I think he's going to play a lot of minutes still, but I think probably a little bit lower owned than he has been in recent games.
And then anything else you want to talk about from the Raptors? I feel like we've kind of covered all the ins and outs of this game.
No, I think that's about it.
All right. Once again, guys, shout out to our sponsor, No House Advantage. If you guys are signing up at No House Advantage for the first time, use the promo code Awesemo. All new users will get a $25 bonus on their first deposit. These are prop-based DFS contests. It's fun. You're building a prop card, and then you're labeling with a confidence interval 1 through 7, the prop you're most confident in hitting. You give it the highest amount of points. If it wins, that's the amount of points your lineup score. So go check it out. Sign up using that promo code Awesemo, and good, different, fun way to play DFS. We also have free projections for it up over on awesemo.com. Let's move to the final game on the slate. It is the Chicago Bulls against the Milwaukee Bucks. This was a game that was surprisingly really competitive in game one for a couple of reasons. Number one, the Bucks were up by 20-something points in the first half, and then the Bulls went on a crazy run in the third quarter and actually briefly took, I believe, a 4-point lead, and then the Bucks cut into that, took the lead towards the end of the quarter, and then that was kind of all she wrote for the rest of the game as the Bucks held on to win. But we're still seeing some depressed price points from Chicago, particularly on DK. DeMar DeRozan, 8,300. Vooch, 7,300. Levine, 7,200. Caruso, 4,300. I think all four of these guys make for really strong plays. Do you see it any differently?
No, I agree. Just really cheap pricing. I mean, Vooch at 7,300, Levine at 7,200, knowing that these guys are going to approach 40 minutes and that they're obviously very good point per minute guys. They're just underpriced. Same goes for DeRozan at 8,300, coming off of a game where he played like 43 minutes, and he's around 1.1 fantasy point per minute guy. Yeah, it's a difficult matchup as far as Milwaukee's good defensively, and they're also heavy favorites at home. But really, really cheap pricing on Chicago here. I think if you were to say, okay, well, I don't want to play Danny Green type guys, I will forego getting Joel Embiid and Durant and Giannis, and I'm going to go more balanced. I think you were relying very heavily on the Chicago pieces because those are the guys, like along with Fred VanVleet, along with Pascal Siakam, those are the guys that can get you 50 plus at a pretty cheap price tag.
Yeah, and is there any individual here that you're prioritizing the highest? Because I just think all of these guys are slightly underpriced. Like, I don't think it's a situation where I'm looking at, egregious misprice. Like I'd call Fred VanVleet's price an egregious misprice. These are just guys that I think are a few $100s too cheap. So I'm likely going to get to a good amount of all of them. But is there any one of these players from the Bulls you're like, oh, this is definitely the best option?
I think they're pretty similar to VanVleet in the mispriced category, but comparing them to each other and comparing them to VanVleet, no, there's not one that like really stands out. It's more so just like, oh, DeRozan fits here, Vooch fits here, Levine fits in this lineup. I don't have a strong preference between them. I just think that they're all like $1,000 below where they should be.
And then is there anybody else on this team that you really like? Because the way I'm viewing it is I really like those four Bulls players. And then everything else is just kind of in the trash bin to me. Like, I don't really want to get to Kobe White here, Patrick Williams, Javonte Green. It's just, I think so much of the playing time and production is going to DeRozan, Vooch, Levine, Caruso, that it doesn't leave much scraps left for anybody else, especially from a usage standpoint. But do you see it any differently? Or is there another cheap guy from Chicago that you do think is a worthy GPP flyer?
So just to quickly clarify too, because I didn't specifically say it, but Caruso also I think a good value here. Like, I don't think he's underpriced to the extent that the other three guys are, but he's also just really cheap and likely to play a lot of minutes. As far as the other, as far as value, guys like Patrick Williams and Kobe White are kind of interesting to me just through the lens of Danny Green is getting 34% ownership, Kobe White's at 15, Patrick Williams is at 14. I understand why Green's getting more ownership, but those guys, like, they both have their issues. Patrick Williams, not a great point per minute guy. He's out there mostly for defensive reasons. Kobe White is certainly capable of filling up the stat sheet, but he's not asked to when he's playing with Levine and Vooch and DeRozan. So they both have their issues, but you're getting, 2-to-1 ownership discount on these guys. I do like them in that sense, but no, I'm not confident in Patrick Williams. I'm not confident in Kobe White.
Good question in our premium Discord channel from Ghetto Farmer Boy. That is a Ghetto Farmer Boy. He wants to know if we'd be willing to play all three Bull stars in the same lineup.
I'm not setting
probably
a rule
not.
against it. I don't think I get it a lot though.
Yeah, I'm not going to set a rule for it, but I just doubt it happens because there's guys around that price range that I like getting to today. Like Fred VanVleet also being another strong one in that price point. And then, I'm going to want to pay up a little bit to get to some of the other stars on the slate. We're about to talk about Chris Middleton on the other side of the game. So I don't think it's going to happen, even if I don't specifically set a rule for it. But it's not something that I'm going to go out of my way to do either.
Yeah, it's kind of the same thing that I was saying with, why I'm capping the Celtics at 3. If I'm playing like one lineup and I'm really looking at what I'm playing, like if I already have DeRozan and Levine, or let's say I have DeRozan and Vooch, sure, I could play Levine, but why wouldn't I rather just play Fred VanVleet and, get somebody from another team instead of somebody that's competing with DeRozan and Vooch across 150 lineups? If that happens here and there, I don't really care. It's only a 3-game slate, but if so I'm not saying a rule against it. I don't think it's going to happen that frequently. And if I were playing, single entry, 3 max, something like that, like if I look at my lineup that I'm putting into like the 2K or the 1K single entry and it has all 3 of them, I'm probably going to go, oh, okay, well, I'll just play a different lineup. So kind of depends on what you're playing too.
And now let's go and talk about the other side of the game. And we've talked about a lot of pay up options on the slate. The one we've not yet talked about is Giannis Antetokounmpo. So we have Giannis today. We have Joel Embiid. We have James Harden. We have Jason Tatum, Jaylen Brown, Kyrie Irving, Kevin Durant. Of all of those names, I have Giannis projected for the most fantasy points. I assume he's going to be the one I get to the most. And he's also not all that popular today either. We've got Giannis projected for 19% ownership on DraftKings. On FanDuel, he's projected for 25% ownership. I think the field's a little bit light on Giannis for a 3-game slate, but how do you think he stacks up to the other stars that we've talked about?
Number one. I don't see any way around it. I mean, you have Chris Middleton, you have Drew Holiday, but Giannis isn't playing with the equivalent of a James Harden or a Joel Embiid or, a Durant, Kyrie. He's better, point per minute wise by a wide margin than somebody like Jason Tatum. So yeah, I don't think it's close. I mean, and he's not really expensive. Like 10-9 for Giannis is underpriced for sure. Like he's a 12K player. So 19% ownership to me seems insane. I get it because there's other options to get to, but if you're going to get comparable if you're going to get similar ownership on, Kevin Durant and Embiid and Harden, give me Giannis and I'll just jam him in everywhere I can.
And the other thing too is that Giannis has better position eligibility than somebody like Embiid. So you could pay $300 more for Giannis, who I also have projected for more fantasy points than Embiid. And Embiid's only center eligible and Giannis is small forward, power forward. So it's going to be a little easier to fit him into lineups just because he has more spots you could roster him in. So I don't really understand the ownership because, like I said, I have Giannis projected higher than Embiid, unless this is just something where a lot of projection sites have Embiid higher than Giannis. And that's the reason why. I don't really understand it. Giannis is going to be my preferred pay-up option on the slate. How do you feel about the other guys on Milwaukee? Drew Holiday, Chris Middleton. I can't really prioritize either of them, but I definitely think they're good plug-in guys for lineups. Like if they fit the amount of salary that's left over.
Yeah, and as far as Giannis goes too, like if you had to make one negative argument against him, it's that he probably isn't going to play as many minutes as guys like Durant and Embiid and Kyrie. But he produces at a better point per minute rate. And I do think he's likely to play more than the 33 to 34 minutes he played last game. Budenholzer decided that it was a good idea to just preemptively foul out his best player at the end of that game instead of letting him, actually do it. So I do think that, in a normal game, you're getting like 36 minutes or so from Giannis as opposed to 33. As far as the rest of the guys, I think Middleton looks good at that price. I think Drew looks good. I do think that, your Fred VanVleet, Zach LaVine, DeMar DeRozan type guys look a little bit better, but especially in lineups where you aren't getting to Giannis, you're still going to want exposure to this Milwaukee team. I mean, they have a 118 implied total. It's the highest on the slate. If Giannis does have a mediocre game, there's a very good chance that it's, the Bulls did something to try and force Middleton or Holiday to beat them. And they are pretty cheap for the minutes they're likely to play. So I think both of those guys look good. From a value standpoint, certainly no issues with, getting to Brook Lopez at 4,800. I don't mind Pat Connaughton at 3,400. He's kind of in that Danny Green category where I'm not overly confident in him. He only played 18 minutes last game as well, but he's really cheap and he's going to let me get some other guys into the lineup that I really like.
I like Brook
Allen at 3,800.
I like Brook Lopez quite a bit for this slate. He played 32 minutes last game and a price point that's about as cheap as we've ever seen a healthy Brook Lopez. For reference, opening day, which was he played and started on an opening day for the Bucks. He was at 5,900. Then he got hurt and missed almost the entire season and didn't return again until March. And then he was playing limited minutes. But I think it's just worth keeping in mind that he opened the season at 5,900. He's back to playing the role we were expecting, and now he's 4,800 on DK. Just once again, on a slate where we're hurting for value, I think Brook Lopez is one of the better cheap plays, and there's clear upside here with Brook Lopez, which when you talk about some of the other cheap guys we've gone through, like Danny Green, Alex Caruso, I think Brook Lopez is slightly higher ceiling than those kind of guys. So I like getting to Lopez here. You'd mentioned Connaughton. Anything else that's worth looking at from the Bucks roster?
I don't really think so. I mean, Wesley Matthews actually closed that game, ended up playing like 27 minutes, but you're still talking about like one of the worst point per minute guys in the league.
All right, guys, do us a favor. Like the video, subscribe to the YouTube channel. We've gone through it all 3 games, and check out the rest of the content we have on the YouTube channel today. We've got the MLB Live Before Lock. We've got the MLB Strategy Show, NBA Deeper Dive, NBA Live Before Lock. And of course, don't forget to follow Jordan Klein on Twitter at Jordan D. Klein. The most important takeaway you could have from today's show. Good luck. I'll see you guys later.